Hi, I'm Angela Hughey,
And I'm Michael Soto.
and we are excited to welcome everyone to the very first episode of Better Together Arizona. And today, Michael, we're going to talk about the path forward to an inclusive Arizona.
We are, and that means we're talking about non-discrimination policy, an update to the current Arizona statutory law that would make sure that all Arizonans are covered under that non-discrimination law.
Yes, and so what we're going to do today is we're going to compare. There's two paths forward, right now.
Yes.
There's the path that we support, which is equality and fairness for all Arizonans.
Right.
And then there's another bill, I think it's HB 2625,
Exactly,
right?
yes.
So we're going to talk about those two bills, but before we get into that, I think we want to kind of lay the groundwork and let people know where we're at right now in the state of Arizona, right?
We do. Let's do it. So in Arizona today, we have 11 municipalities that have non-discrimination ordinances, which is great. But ultimately, what that means is that about 48% of the state is not covered because of population-wise, right? In terms of these laws. And so we're living in a state where, kind of depending on where you are, where you live, you might be covered by non-discrimination law that is inclusive, or you might not be.
Well, and we like to say that your rights shouldn't depend on your zip code, right?
Absolutely.
And I always talk about how Sherry and I love to take, big, bold adventures throughout our great state. And if we leave, we live in Phoenix, which has an LGBTQ inclusive ordinance and hasn't since 2013. But if we leave a municipality that is LGBTQ inclusive, then if we lose rights, if you're an LGBTQ plus Arizonan, or if you're visiting here, right? Which is important to note.
Exactly. A couple weeks ago, I was driving up to northwestern Arizona, and for the majority of that drive, if I would have gotten into an accident, I wouldn't have been guaranteed as a transgender person that an ER would have to treat me. That's pretty alarming.
It is, right? So we should do better. We can do better. And then also, when we're talking about LGBTQ inclusive ordinances, they cover three areas, right? They cover employment.
Yes.
They cover housing.
Yep.
And then they cover public accommodations.
Exactly.
And as you've just alluded to, public accommodations is much more than restaurants and hotels.
It really is. It covers a lot of things in our lives. Not everything, right? But it covers a lot of public life, of existing as a person in society,
including doctors' offices and ERs and hospitals.
Exactly.
And you'll note, if you see the presentation, that we say that it's not illegal to be discriminated against in employment if you work for an employer that has less than 15 employees.
Right.
Let's talk about that. That's the Boss Talk decision federally, right?
It is. So the federal non-discrimination law for everything has that 15 employees limit, right? And so it doesn't impact smaller employers, which I think made a lot of sense when that law was made, right? When those laws were first made.
Literally decades ago.
Yeah, in the 60s, right? And in other decades, subsequent laws. And so that made more sense then, I think, because of perhaps a lack of technology, a lack of access to knowledge, right, and legal resources, all of those sorts of things. But we live in a really different world today where at your fingertips, right, you've got kind of all the information you could need. And so, that 15 number doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense for the 21st century.
Right.
And you see that in our bill.
Well, you see that in our bill, and you see it in the 11 municipal ordinances too, right?
Yes.
Because you've got 7 ordinances that are at 0.
Yep.
And you have 4 ordinances where it's employers that have 5 or more employees.
Yep.
I've moved to the next slide that really, I think, is very tangible, right? Because you mentioned that we don't have coverage based on population in 48% of the state. Right. But when we actually look at the depth and breadth of Arizona, unless you're in one of these teeny tiny little white dots, if you're LGBTQ plus, you don't have the same rights and protections as your non-LGBTQ plus counterparts. So clearly we have work to do, and this is why we absolutely believe that we need to have a statewide update.
Exactly. And when we go to the next slide, we have, based on land mass, you can see that less than 15% of Arizona, of
Right.
the actual land mass, is actually protected by the laws,
Right.
by these 11 municipal laws. And so that leaves a whole lot of Arizona unprotected.
Well, I mean, you leave Phoenix, you're driving down to Tucson, and as soon as you leave Phoenix,
Yeah.
there are no LGBTQ plus protections until you get to Tucson, right?
Exactly.
And then depending on where you go to the east and the west as well. So
Right.
again, our rights shouldn't depend on our zip code, and we want to make sure that we're living in a state that celebrates, respects, and protects everyone equally, right?
Exactly.
So, yeah.
Exactly.
More work ahead.
Much more work ahead. So let's talk a little bit about the values behind non-discrimination, behind non-discrimination laws, and behind how we crafted our bill specifically. So we have the similar situation in the United States as we do in our state, right? Where part of the nation is protected, but also much of the nation is not. And so with these 21 states, we've got the gray there that shows you the 21 states, and the pink that are in some way protected. But there's a whole lot of red on that map, a whole lot of red.
There's a lot of red, and I think if you are in Arizona and you are all about top talent attraction, you should really be concerned that Arizona is surrounded by states that have more equal protections than the state of Arizona does.
Yes, exactly.
Maricopa County, I think, is the fastest growing county in our nation.
Yeah.
We have big businesses that are coming here. We've got that big TSMC plant, $60 billion investment in the Northwest Valley.
Yeah.
It doesn't have inclusive protections in place, right?
Exactly. And you talk to anybody on city council or in a county supervisor in Arizona, and you know that makes a difference in whether people decide to move here, from individuals and families to top companies looking to actually employ hundreds to thousands of people.
So our point is that having statewide LGBTQ inclusive protections isn't just the right thing to do. It's really good for the business of Arizona.
It's good for everybody, right? It's
everybody wins.
Everybody wins with more inclusive policy, right? That's actually how rights are supposed to work in this country.
Yep.
Yes. So let's talk a little bit about pluralism. So pluralism is the idea that different people can live together respectfully, right? That we can be citizens and neighbors of the same nation, the same state, and we don't have to live the exact same way. That is a foundational idea for our country and a foundational idea for our bill.
Right. And I mean, we really are community. Pluralism really is about community, right?
Absolutely.
Sherry and I are the only LGBTQ plus couple that lives in our little townhouse community, right? But we are neighbors and we are friends and we are all working together to build a stronger fabric in our community.
Yes, exactly. And this, while perhaps not every individual in our nation, ascribes to this belief, we have people that display hate in lots of different ways, right? Perhaps, we have run up against those people in our individual lives. This is the goal, right? And the belief that if we all ascribe to this belief that our diversity makes us stronger, right? And that my freedom to live how I want to live and the way that's right for me and my family doesn't have to be the way that's right for you and your family.
Right.
And we can still be friends and neighbors, right? We don't have to think the same. We don't have to believe the same. And we can still live together peacefully. That's a pretty wonderful and unique idea in the history of the world, quite honestly. But it's also sort of the magic sauce of this country, right?
Correct.
It's what makes it work here.
So dive deeper into that definition for folks that maybe haven't heard of pluralism before.
Yeah, it's a big, complicated word. Definitely get that. And so pluralism, we kind of break it down here in a couple of ways, a couple bullet points, just to help you understand this. So, a core part of pluralism is understanding that different people from different walks of life have different ideas, right? And live differently, essentially. And so, you and I think, are a great example, right? You come from a non-religious family.
Absolutely.
Like a little bit of religion, but not a ton. I come from a very religious family, right? And we are still very good friends, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's what's so cool about Arizona and about our nation, right? Is that we all have different lived experiences, right? And so, but it's that respect for difference. And then also, I think the ability to learn from difference too, which I think is so awesome.
And that's we have learned so much from each other, right? Like I learned so much about the world by being your friend and by knowing you and Sherry, right? It changes the way way that I understand the world, and I hope I do the same for you.
Absolutely.
And like, it makes me a better person, right? It makes me a more empathetic person, right? It makes me someone who can understand people in general a little bit better. And that's kind of the idea behind pluralism, right? Is the more that we know people that live differently than us, sort of the better humans we are, right? Because once you learn that people live differently than you and are still wonderful humans, you're less afraid of them, right?
Well, yes, and from a one community standpoint, we always say, like, just remember what we have what we have in common is our humanity,
absolutely.
right? Let's meet on the things and agree on the things that we can really agree on, and let's build the bridge, right? Which is so much like about literally the core values of how we built out equality and fairness for all Arizonans.
It really is.
Yeah.
A core part of pluralism also is respect for difference, right? And again, you get greater respect for difference the more difference you are exposed to, because you see the value in that. And so that's a really key part of our bill. It's a key part of our philosophy. Is that different isn't scary.
It should be a key part of our society as well. I mean, it really should be.
Yes.
What I get so concerned just on a personal level about how polarizing things are. And I'm like, how do we bring the temperature down and get back to a place of just respect and respect for difference, and be able to actually have dialogue, right?
Absolutely. Well, and I think this idea of pluralism and respect for difference is actually a core part of the civil rights movement in general, right? Whether we're talking about the suffrage movement, right, in the early 1900s and before, or the civil rights, movement led by Dr. Martin Luther King and so many others in the 60s, 50s and 60s. And so that respect for difference is something we've been working for in this society for a very long time. And of course, it makes sense that it would be a core part of our bill.
Well, and as LGBTQ plus Arizonans and LGBTQ plus Americans, really, I mean, that's the point, right? Is like, you don't have to live the way we live.
Right.
We're asking simply to have the same rights and protections as everyone else has, because we are Americans.
Exactly. Yeah. We're Americans. We're human beings, right? All people deserve respect. That's another key part of it, right? These might sound like simplistic things, but they're actually really key tenets to a fair and civil society.
Well, and my concern is we've gotten away from this, right?
Totally.
Like we've gotten into, there's so much othering going on, right? Yeah. And it seems like we're trying to pit different minority groups against one another, or harm minority groups and other minority groups, whether it's around immigration or anti-LGBTQ plus legislation, or an attempted Muslim ban. This othering is so harmful, really, to the fabric of our nation. We're trying to get back to that with equality and fairness for all Arizonans.
We are, and we're trying to realize the parts of pluralism that have never been realized in our country, right? And so we're human beings. We're never perfect, right? Policy is never perfect. We can see that from everything from the 1964 Civil Rights Act to our Constitution, right? And our founding documents. But we're always striving to get there, right? And so this respect for others is a core part of that.
Yeah. And equality of all citizens.
Exactly. Equality of all people, so that people can pursue their lives and their values, right, according to their values.
Which is the American dream.
It is. Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's something that I hope we can all support, right? And something we can all stand behind.
Absolutely.
All right. Should we go to the next slide?
Absolutely.
All right. So,
I mean, this is pluralism.
Right it is. Here. It is.
Equality means equality for everyone.
It does. It absolutely does. And so that is people that live like us and people that don't, right? And even people that have active disagreement with us, right?
Absolutely.
That's actually, in some ways, I think that's the greatest fulfillment of civil rights and of rights in general, is actually working to ensure that people that actively disagree with you still have the right to do that.
The right to disagree.
Exactly.
Yes, absolutely. Exactly. All right. So I feel like we've set the table.
Yes.
Let's dive in and start talking about these two bills. So here we go into our side-by-side bill comparison, right?
Excellent. And so we have these two bills. We have our bill, Equality and Fairness for All Arizonans, and then HB 2625. Both of these bills were dropped this session. And so throughout like throughout the LGBTQ movements work for equality in Arizona, we've dropped different bills as a community.
Absolutely.
Right? And sometimes there's one bill that is about non-discrimination. Many times there have been several. And so this is pretty normal.
It's been really common that there's been two different paths since like 2018. 2019,
exactly.
Right? There's been two bills typically.
Exactly. And that's just for non-discrimination. We've seen this also in terms of conversion therapy bans and all sorts of other things, right? Where even different legislators will drop different versions of bills, right? This is very, very common because how you make good policy is you bring all the ideas together, right? Yeah. And then you hopefully select the best from those ideas and you get to the policy you want.
Yes. And we think it's time to really, I think, do a really big deep dive into what both of these policies actually have in them.
Yes.
Because we see the potential for an opportunity in 2025, right?
We do.
Now, no one knows how this November election is going to go.
Right.
But it seems like it's time that we really start to closely examine what is in both Equality and Fairness for All Arizonans and HB 2625 so that people are really educated on how both of these bills attempt to move forward and can make educated decisions.
And they're different strategies because both bills have they have very different strategies, which I think you can also understand from the groups that wrote these bills, right? And that support them. There are different strategies for moving forward. Not to say that either is wrong, right? They're just different and have different opportunities in terms of becoming law.
Right.
So that's what we want to examine here. So let's start with something that probably sounds really boring to a lot of people, but definitions. This is actually a really important part of law. When we're writing law, frequently, very common sense terms must be defined because what's common sense to me may not be common sense to somebody else, right?
So I think what you're really saying here is if we don't define it, someone else could define it for us.
100%, absolutely. Okay. And so that's why we want to be really clear with our definitions in terms of how we define things specifically for implementation, right? Because if we are not thinking of how these definitions will be operationalized and implemented, we're missing an opportunity to do good work in terms of public policy and, again, opening up a door for misinterpretation.
Misinterpretation and then potentially litigation, too.
Absolutely, yes.
So, you've said implementation twice, right? Yeah. So I think, obviously, our belief and really the strategy for Equality and Fairness for All Arizonans is this is ready to be implemented on day one.
Exactly. We wrote this really carefully so that it is as easy as law can be to be interpreted as it is supposed to be interpreted according to the new law and implemented immediately by state agencies, right?
Got it.
By the people who carry out the law. And so we start with sexual orientation. A lot of people, are probably like that. Why do we need to define that? Real obvious. Again, you can't take that for granted in terms of public policy. So our bill defines sexual orientation and, in fact, uses the Federal Equality Act definition for sexual orientation, which is heterosexuality, bisexuality, and homosexuality. Clinical terms, certainly, we understand that, but they are reflective of, the kind of technical language that you need in law. Okay. And they're also reflective. Those are kind of the three big umbrella terms in terms of human sexuality. And so it covers everybody under those terms.
Got it.
So that's very important for us. Clear and simple legal definition, right? They are technical sounding, but that's how law is, right? It's pretty technical.
And again, we're going to define it because we don't want someone else to define it.
Exactly. Okay? And so we're trying to be very clear, very simple, very specific. This draws on, past precedent as well in terms of law. And so we always want to do that because that creates supporting ground for our law and for our bill.
Meaning that there's less likelihood for litigation again.
Exactly.
Implementation versus litigation.
Yes. Got and it. If there is litigation, that it's quickly resolved. And so that's, kind of always, you and I tend to prefer to write statutory law that can just be implemented and not litigated because that's just where we come from. Again, that's not everybody's philosophy, and that's fine. But for us, that's what will meet our end goal faster, right? And that's how we write law.
Back to our core values. I mean, This is written with pluralism in mind, and then also we truly believe that our job is to get the most protections for LGBTQ plus Arizonans as quickly as we possibly can.
Exactly.
We don't want any roadblocks.
We don't. And we don't want any delays. We don't want roadblocks. We want to meet the actual needs of LGBTQ Arizonans as soon as humanly possible. And so that is why we wrote the bill the way that we wrote the bill, right? And why we made lots of decisions that we made, so that it could be implemented quickly with great haste and speed, so that LGBTQ Arizonans could benefit immediately on day one.
Including the importance of a definition for sexual orientation.
Exactly. The other bill, HB 2625, does not have a definition for sexual orientation. And so we see this as a miss, problem. Right? Yeah, as a problem, because it opens up that door for misinterpretation. Right?
And if we don't define it, someone
else will. Exactly. So let's talk about gender identity now. We also define gender identity. Again, people may be rolling their eyes and be like, why? It's so obvious.
And I don't know why people would roll their eyes around gender identity, because I think so much of the discussion right now in Arizona and really throughout our nation is that truly that people don't understand gender identity.
Oh my gosh, it's so true.
And they don't understand that everyone has a gender identity.
Exactly. And so we want to make that clear, right?
Yeah.
And so we also want to write the definition for gender identity in a way that transgender people can use this to actually legally transition in the best way possible, right?
Because again, the most rights and protections as quickly as possible.
Exactly.
So clinical.
Yes.
Very straightforward, and then options.
Yes.
Okay.
Lots of options. And so for gender identity, we took existing law again because of that precedent piece, right? We want to make sure that we are building upon the successful law of the past. And so we took language from Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Utah. We thought 2 blue states, one red state made a lot of sense. Exactly. Lots of balance. All of these laws have existed for more than a decade. And so they have been very successful in their implementation and the benefits that they have brought to transgender people specifically in their state. And so we thought, hey, this is a really good solid ground to start from. And so we give really well delineated options for transgender people in this law to assert our gender identity, which is very important. We're using this legal language that actually builds upon and includes current administrative law so that people can continue to, so that there's no stop, right, in legally transitioning people, but also expands current administrative law. So best of both worlds in lots of ways, right? And so we like that. So we keep the administrative process moving forward and we bring more people into it.
Okay. And in this case, you want to look at the definition?
Yeah, let's look at the definition. So we're going to go to the next slide. And so you can see here, this is, our definition is longer, certainly, not the only thing about it. But a part of this definition is that we give people options, and the trans community, just like any other part of the LGBTQ community, is not a monolith, right? We're not all the same. We don't live the same. We live very different lives, even within the transgender community. And so we need different ways and different routes potentially to assert our gender identity. And so we try to cover lots of different ways to do that. And so we've got 3 options here. Please note that it's including any of these, not all of them.
Any is the key word here, right?
Exactly.
And I know I've talked to people out in the community, and they've thought that, mistakenly believed that this definition was all A, B, and C.
Right.
And it is any.
Right. It's
very
A,
clearly.
Or B or C. And so you don't have to do all of these things, right? It's giving different routes, again, because trans people, like everybody else, are different kinds of people. And so those different routes to assert your gender identity legally, again, right? This is it for legal processes of transitioning, include A, medical history, care, or treatment of gender identity. So I would fall easily into that path because I have had medical interventions in my life, right? And I've sought those out to medically transition. Not every transgender person does. And so then we've got B and C.
Okay.
B is consistent and uniform assertion of gender identity. And so that's, I'm a man because I say I'm a man. So great. Okay, here you go. You get to transition, right? And then C, other evidence that the gender identity is sincerely held, a part of a person's core identity and is not being asserted for improper purposes. And so this is I'm a man because I say I'm a man, with some additional comfort language for our entire coalition, right? We have a large coalition behind us that spans every walk of life because we believe in doing policy
Right.
work that way. And so this to this the improper purpose piece of this, right, not being asserted for improper purposes, is essentially comfort language for our greater coalition that says, this is trans people who are legally transitioning, not just someone changing, their gender marker for other reasons.
In what you hear typically from folks that are not supportive of LGBTQ inclusive
Right.
policy is it's really not gay people or even transgender people that we're worried about.
Right.
It's people that will self-assert that they are
Yes.
transgender
For harm.
for harmful reasons.
Exactly. So we're actively excluding that.
We're actively excluding it.
Yes.
And then also I think we just need to take a look at history. Remember that we have 11 LGBTQ inclusive municipal ordinances in the state of Arizona.
Mhm.
There is no uptick in any issues
Exactly.
in public spaces
Exactly.
with people pretending
Right.
to be transgender,
Right.
to do harm, number one.
Right.
And I also think it's important to assert, again, to folks that are not supportive of LGBTQ inclusive policy,
Yep.
that it is against the law to harm people.
No matter who you are,
Period.
Period. And I think by including this language, we are saying very clearly we are changing this law to be inclusive of transgender people, that big umbrella of trans people. We are not changing the law to make this easier for people to harm anyone. And
No.
we know that doesn't happen, but it's also okay to say we don't believe that anybody should be harmed and we don't support that. And
Well, of course we don't think people should be harmed.
Exactly. So that's our definitions. We think they make a lot of sense, again, because you can choose kind of your own adventure as a trans person there, right? You get to pick the piece that works for you in terms of legally transitioning.
But again, it's important to define in a really thoughtful way, because if we don't define in a thoughtful way in the bill, someone else can.
Exactly.
And these are 3 opportunities that have been used in existing legislative policy that has been in place for over a decade.
Exactly. And have worked so well for the trans communities in those states, right? Massachusetts and Connecticut, some of the sort of most liberal states in the union, right? And trans people have been flourishing in those states for a very long time, have very good laws locally, statewide, and in municipal locations, right? Just thriving communities where trans people can go and live wonderful lives.
So
Same
the intent is implementation.
Yes.
Not to be burdensome.
Yes.
To give people who are transgender an opportunity to choose which way they prove their gender identity.
Yep.
And it's an any, not an all.
Not an all. Exactly. The other bill, HB 2625, right? Their definition for us, we think, is a bit of a circular definition, right? It doesn't, for me in particular, I don't think that this definition actually takes into consideration implementation. So it doesn't give these different means to actually legally transitioning. And so we think it's a weaker definition because of that. And again, kind of more open to interpretation and not based on existing law.
Got it.
And so just,
implementation is the key. And then also ease of use for the MVD or whoever, issues legal documents as well, right?
Like the Department of the Vital Records Department, right? The Motor Vehicles Department, right? If the law is difficult to interpret and not written for implementation, like our bill's written very clearly. You've got 3 pathways that are either or, right? You don't have to do all 3. HB 2625 doesn't have those pathways and has a pretty circular definition that I think is going to take those state agencies a minute to translate and to implement.
And I want to go back to our core belief, which is the most protections for LGBTQ plus Arizonans as quickly as we possibly can.
Exactly.
All right.
Exactly.
Got it.
All right.
Next slide.
So let's talk about employment. So that is one of the 3 big areas of non-discrimination in non-discrimination law. And I know an area that's close to your heart. So
yeah, it absolutely is. So obviously, equality and fairness for all Arizonans adds sexual orientation and gender identity to the list of already protected human characteristics and religion. We have a new piece that comes in that makes sure that that we are protecting equally religious minorities. This is super important and very, like, I think super close to us too. I mean, we live in a state that has 22 American Indian tribes, right? And there are so many people that believe in a non-Christian way, right? I spoke about TSMC earlier. You've got a $60 billion investment in the Northwest Valley. That T in TSMC stands for Taiwan. I did a little research, and 92% of people that are Taiwanese are actually Buddhist, right? So they have a non-Christian belief system. And then we did more research collaboratively, and what we saw is that religious minorities oftentimes have a very high percentage of discrimination in the workplace. We know how bad discrimination in the workplace feels, right? There's nothing worse than putting your family and the opportunity to provide for your family at risk because you don't have equal protections in the workplace. So this religious minority piece was super important to our team. We're very excited about it. And then the number that we chose, and that number is 5, right? So again, let's go back. There are 11 municipal ordinances. 7 of those ordinances are at 0 employees, meaning if you are an LLC, you're open, you might be an entrepreneur, a solo entrepreneur, you do not have the right to discriminate. When we got into Mesa, we were coming out of COVID, and there was a concern that there could be a perceived undue burden for solopreneurs. And so the compromise was to go to the number 5. And that number 5 was chosen because California has statewide protections and their employment number is 5. So we said, well, if it's good enough for California, it's good enough for Arizona. And so moving forward, when we look at the other 85% of the state, in employment, that number would be 5. I think it's super important.
Just makes sense in so many ways. You know, it's interesting, I think. We know that discrimination in the workplace is real when it comes to racism, when it comes to LGBTQ people, but I think that we forget far too often that discrimination in the workplace is real still for religious belief as well.
Absolutely.
And so our belief, again, is that equality means equality for all, and that includes everyone and fighting every form of discrimination. And so it was so important to us to add that. We think that HB 2625 explicitly does not have those kinds of protections.
So we don't think it covers enough, number one. But it should cover religious minorities. But then the other thing that HB 2625 does, which I just don't understand, is their number is 15. Which is federal law, right? But this is an opportunity to do better than federal law.
And
when you can do better, you should do better.
You should do better.
And here's the other piece that I don't understand, because HB 2625 is supported by the ACLU and HRC, who have participated in some of these municipal ordinances that have been enacted in Arizona.
Absolutely.
And have wanted the number to be 0. So I don't understand why that number would go up. And then, Michael, if we're reading this correctly, this HB 2625 as well, we think that it's preemptive in employment too, right? That's our concern. And so if it's preemptive, you have the city of Phoenix, you have Tempe, you have 11 municipalities that are at 5, right? Or 0. And if HB 2625 passes, they would all move up to 15.
They would.
So you would take existing protections in employment away, not just from LGBTQ plus Arizonans, but people based on disability, race, creed, age, all of the other human characteristics that are already currently covered.
Which then means if I'm the mayor of one of those cities, I'm going to want to sue the state because my law's better than the state law then. And so I don't want my law having to change and my protections being less than they were.
Less robust.
Exactly.
And it's a local control issue.
Absolutely. Local control issue, all of those things. And so we think that's really problematic about the bill, is that it creates this opportunity for litigation that, quite frankly, if I'm a city that has better protections for anybody, I'm going to want to go after that and preserve my protections.
The city of Phoenix ordinance took 22 years to get over the line. The Mesa, Scottsdale, Glendale, and Chandler ordinances took 7 to 8 years to get over the line.
Yeah.
Winslow, we got over the line, and then it was put on the ballot in 2020, and over 60% of the people that live in Winslow adopted an LGBTQ inclusive ordinance in the town of Winslow. These have been really thoughtful, hard-fought battles, for a lack of a better word, to gain LGBTQ inclusive protections in these 11 municipal ordinances, to come in and say, we're going to take some of those rights away and those protections away. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
Agreed.
It's preemptive. It doesn't make, it just makes no sense. And then it's this implementation versus potential litigation piece too, right?
Yep.
And again, let's go back to what is our job? It's to get the most rights and protections for LGBTQ as quickly as possible.
Yep.
So I don't think that HB 2625 does that.
I don't think so either. And so I think that our bill does, right? It's ready to go on day one.
Yep.
It doesn't have these litigation challenge issues, and it expands everybody's rights.
Absolutely.
So
well,
that's a win.
It's a huge win. And we talk about this all the time too, that like when you have LGBTQ inclusive protections, it's not just good for LGBTQ plus Arizonans.
Right.
This is good for everyone in our great state. And this is actually adding additional protections to people who aren't LGBTQ plus.
Exactly. And that's wonderful, right? And that, I think that reflects our view of rights in general. It's not, they're not a scarcity product, right? This is not a market-based thing, right? Where more rights for you means less for me. It actually is more rights for you, create an environment that make more rights for me possible.
The rising tide lifts all boats.
Exactly. And so we want to enforce and create mechanisms in our law that protect everyone's rights, and that actually creates a freer society.
Absolutely.
Yes.
All right, moving on.
All right, so let's talk about housing. So housing is really important because this is pretty much, when you ask any LGBT person, this is like top concern, right? Because if you don't have secure, stable housing, you can't really do anything else in life, right? And so both our bill and the other bill add sexual orientation and gender identity as protected classes, which is good. Our bill has some religious exemptions in it that essentially ensure that single gender environments can still be existing, right, in housing environments specifically for religious institutions. And so this is a pretty specific instance, but if we're talking about, say, the Catholic Church, right, men and women live in single gendered environments for the most part. We have priests living together and nuns living together, right? Our bill says that doesn't have to change. And even in retirement, the Catholic Church owns retirement facilities for priests and nuns, right? That those facilities can stay, and that is not a violation of the law.
Okay.
Which we just think makes sense, right? Why?
Well, and again, this is pluralism.
Yep.
Yeah. So, I think it makes all the sense in the world.
Yeah. Just because you and I did not become a priest and a nun doesn't mean that other people didn't, and we shouldn't respect that.
Absolutely.
And so, the other bill, HB 2625, does not have these exemptions for religious institutions for these single gender housing environments, and we think that's a weakness of the bill.
Right.
And we just want to keep respecting everyone, right?
Well, yeah, and then in employment, we were talking about preemption, and we were saying HB 2625 preempted, right?
Yep.
But our bill is preemptive in housing. But it's a different type of preemption?
It is. It's a positive preemption, and it basically says that any other type of form of government in our state would not be allowed to strip protections from LGBTQ people in housing. And so we're creating that floor. Yeah, we're creating that floor of these are minimum protections that must be afforded to LGBTQ Arizonans throughout the state, no matter what.
And I want to go back to employment for just a second, because what we're really saying is with HB 2625, it's creating a ceiling, right? That 15. Everybody
has to be here, and you can't do better.
Got it.
And so we don't want to do that, right? Like, to establish a baseline, a floor, or a foundation of law is fine, but to create a cap, a limit of law, we don't want to do, right? Because we want people to be able to do better if they can.
Well, and because, again, in particular in employment, going back to these 11 municipalities, 7 of them are at 0. So even at 5, you have 7 that are going to be better, right?
Exactly.
Than the proposed equality and fairness for all Arizonans bill.
Exactly.
Got it.
So, all right, public accommodations. This is the big one. There's a lot that it falls under public accommodations, and so this is a big section of the law. Both bills add sexual orientation and gender identity as protected classes to public accommodations, which is great, but we have different ways of doing that. And so ours we go out of our way to be very respectful of other people. Again, pluralism, right? Our bill, law can tell people and institutions how to treat people, right? And create that fair playing field for all people, but it can't change the way that people think or feel, right? And so we recognize the limits of the law. So our bill, in that creating a fair playing field, goes out of our way, and we think in the appropriate way, to respect cultures and groups that are different than us. And again, with this single gender environments, it preserves the ability of groups to have single gender environments and ensures that they're LGBTQ inclusive, right? And so, what are some examples of this that you can think of in life of single gender environments?
I go to the choirs, the LGBTQ choirs. I always think the Phoenix Men's Choir and the Phoenix Women's Choir, they are single gender clubs and organizations. And under our bill, they are allowed to remain exactly how they are.
They are, exactly. And we think that's really important because that's actually a long held tradition in our own community, right? Of having the men's choir and the women's choir. Those are foundational groups to a lot of LGBTQ communities in the United States, and we don't see any need to change their existence.
Right.
They don't need to merge and become one choir, right? They can still continue to exist as a men's choir and a women's choir, and they need to be trans inclusive, right? And so
yes, so you just have to be LGBTQ plus inclusive. So I brought up 2 LGBTQ based organizations,
right?
So let's take this a little broader, and then let's look at like the National Association of Women Business Owners, or the Thunderbirds, right? Who, a charitable organization which is men only,
right?
So much great work. These organizations can still exist under equality and fairness for all Arizonans.
Exactly, and they need to be trans inclusive, right?
Right.
These are business organizations that should be open to everyone, right? So as a trans man, if I want to join the Thunderbirds and I meet their qualifications for membership, I should be able to. There's so many different civil...
If I'm a transgender woman and I own a business and I want to join NABO, then I'm absolutely able to. Right?
Exactly.
Okay. So we're inclusive of the LGBTQ community, but we're allowing single gender spaces to remain.
Exactly. So our goal is not to get rid of single gender spaces. It's just to make them fully inclusive.
Okay.
So we think that's very important.
What does HB 2625 do in this situation?
So our interpretation of the bill is that it is hazy on this, I think, at best, right? It does not clearly preserve these single gender spaces and making them LGBTQ inclusive. The way that their bill's written, their definition of gender identity, all of those things, because they aren't as clear as ours or as intentional as ours, it's our belief that this opens the door to litigation, right? And so this opens the door to challenging the men's and women's choirs or the business associations, right?
Fraternities and sororities?
Right, or Black philanthropic organizations, which are often divided by gender, right? Like any number of things. And so again, that's moves us into litigation, right? And that lack of clarity around preserving these spaces but making them inclusive for all people that identify as a man or a woman, it just creates this gray area and this lack of straightforward, clear, and simple policy that we think opens that litigation door again instead of implementation day one.
Implementation, equality and fairness for all Arizonans.
Yes.
Litigation, HB 2625.
Exactly.
Got it.
Yep. So public accommodations also includes social services. And so let's talk specifically about social services and public accommodations. Again, still including sexual orientation and gender identity. In these, social services, when you're seeking social services as an individual, you're typically in a very vulnerable position in a traumatic situation, right? And so here we're talking about people experiencing homelessness, people in domestic violence situations, right? People that need help outside of just their immediate family or support network into this big network of social service organizations. And so, so here we we're very careful in how we crafted this law because everyone in that situation is vulnerable, experiencing trauma, right? And we don't want to exacerbate
We want
either of
everyone
those.
treated with dignity and respect.
Yes.
And we understand that these are extenuating circumstances.
Exactly.
Okay.
And we understand that not everybody thinks alike or experiences life the same, right? And so this is not the moment when someone is very vulnerable and in a traumatic situation to tell them that how they see the world is wrong, right? And so
it's to provide them with services that they need desperately.
Yes, and to provide everyone with that same kind of service, with dignity, with respect, right? With
and
privacy and safety. And so for us, we wrote this section of the law to emphasize privacy and safety for all people. Our ideal situation, I think, is where a lot of social services are going, although we know it takes money to do this and will take time to implement it. But, currently, I don't know if a lot of people know this, but currently how many homeless shelters or domestic violence shelters work is you put everybody of one gender in one big room, right? And this includes sleeping facilities, shower facilities, and bathroom facilities right off of that, right? So not a lot of privacy, not a lot of dignity, honestly, for anybody, right? And so our bill encourages social service organizations to switch to the newer model of greater privacy, individualized, sort of sleeping areas and washing and bathing facilities that are not familiar or not similar to the middle school gym right class and locker room. But
well, I mean, the city has bought some
yes.
hotels that weren't being used,
right?
And they're creating housing. There's new housing that's being built in the West Valley that are individualized units
exactly.
for folks. Again, this is about dignity,
respect, privacy, safety. Exactly. And so those are the foundational words for this section. Again, not every social service that provides these services is doing that for everyone they serve right now. So for those group settings where we have large groups of people housed together, bathing together, right, doing sort of just living very private parts of our lives together, safety is always a concern, regardless of whether trans people are there or not, right? And that's just a reality of these situations. When you add trans people into this situation, I think we experience a whole lot less safety, right, in these environments.
Talk about that.
So as a trans person, right, we are the ones who often are facing violence, right? We're the people who are subjected to violence in these public-private spaces like locker rooms, bathrooms, right? Shelter facilities. We are the people who are facing sexual violence or physical violence in these settings. That's not talked about a lot in today's society. There's a lot of the opposite being said on for people that don't want transgender people to have equal access and equal rights. A lot of fear mongering, right, and myths out there that we are predators or perpetrators of violence. We know that this isn't true, right? Just from the experience of transgender people and the studying of this that has been done. It's actually trans people that face violence in these situations. And so we took that into consideration when we wrote this too, is because we were like, well, okay, so if we don't consider that and we just say house trans women with cisgender women and trans men with cisgender men, that puts me in a really vulnerable situation, right? I would not want to be housed with cisgender men because I have not had bottom surgery, right? That could put me in a really
You're in a much less safe situation if you're integrated.
Oh my God, I'm in a very dangerous situation if I'm integrated, right? And the same is true for any trans people, right? If we are in a situation that, just in general, in these situations with cisgender people, our level of potential for being harmed increases significantly.
Got it.
And that's true for trans women and trans men, right? Our safety declines very significantly if we are housed in these vulnerable times with other vulnerable people facing trauma. That goes even higher, right? And so our bill really says that, if you have the training in the facility, right, the facilities to safely integrate transgender people with cisgender people, and you can guarantee trans people's safety, great, okay. That takes a lot. If you don't, then create a safe space for trans people to sleep, right? And perhaps that is not with cisgender people. That actually might be right now in this sort of imperfect
The
transition
safest way
moment.
for everyone.
Exactly.
Got it.
Especially for transgender people, right? All transgender people. Honestly, I would rather be housed with any trans person if I was in that kind of situation than, with cisgender people. And I have experienced homelessness in my early days of coming out and being a 19, 20-year-old that came out as trans, was rejected by my family, didn't have a lot of options. That's a really scary thing. And so we want to make sure that everyone is treated with dignity and respect in that case. And so
privacy and safety.
Yeah, and we think this is the best way to do that in an imperfect system. This may not be necessary 20 years from now, right?
Well, we hope it's not.
We hope it's not. Exactly. We hope that social services have evolved greatly and are treating everyone with more and more dignity and safety and privacy and respect. That's not how they're set up today for a lot of facilities. Mostly, I think, because of budgetary reasons, not because of lack of desire. But until we get to that place where everybody has that greater privacy, that greater dignity, we have to create an option that creates safety first, right? That's really the primary concern in these settings, and safety for transgender people,
right?
Because we're the ones who get harmed in these situations. So let's create a safe option. Our bill does that. It creates that pathway to create a safe environment for transgender people. It doesn't say you must just integrate us regardless of safety, right?
So safety, 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 safety.
Absolutely.
Let's talk about HB 2625.
So our reading of this bill is that it doesn't do that, right? It's an integration bill. It's house trans men with cis men, house, trans women with cis men or cis women. Sorry. So which I think on the surface sounds good to people, right? We're used to slogans, trans women are women. Yep, we know trans women are women. We've been fighting for that forever. Trans men are men. We know that. But in this setting, a slogan doesn't meet the safety needs, right? Because there are very real human, everyday things that happen that may not fit that slogan, right? And that may not guarantee the safety of an individual or a group of people.
So again, imperfect solution, but safety first with equality and fairness for all Arizonans.
Yes.
And when we look at HB 2625, we really have some pretty serious safety concerns.
We do. And for an imperfect society, right? I mean, it's less than 26% of Americans say that they know a transgender person. It's wonderful to create. We have to create inclusive law, but again, we don't change the way that every Arizonan thinks on day one, right? And so, especially in this vulnerable setting where everybody is feeling that trauma, that sense of vulnerability, again, not the time to say, the way that you see the world is wrong, and please don't be mean to this trans person that just needs to sleep.
Right.
Likelihood of being mean to that trans person that just needs to sleep goes up, exceptionally. And so safety first. Let's house trans people in ways that guarantee our safety. That's the most important, and create an inclusive environment. The important thing here is creating those services so that trans people who are experiencing homelessness or domestic violence are not in that situation any longer that they need to be. So they get the services, we get the services in a safe way for us. Imperfect solution for an imperfect society, but it creates that baseline of safety and services. And we think it's the best way. Yeah.
Got it.
We think it's the best way right now. Again, hopefully 20 years, different story. Right now,
I think a lot
solution.
Of conversations will be changing in the next 20 years.
I mean, they've changed drastically in the last 20 years.
They certainly have. Yeah, definitely.
All right, let's talk about education a little bit. So education, you and I have talked about this a ton because these two bills take a very different approach to education. Our bill, it reinforces existing Arizona law. And so existing Arizona law says that K through 12 schools are not places of public accommodation.
Right.
So
and that a non-discrimination update should be about employment, it should be about housing, and it should be about public accommodations.
Exactly.
And in saying that doesn't mean that we don't think that we need new laws and policy in place when it comes to K through 12 education.
Absolutely.
It simply means that we understand that we need a different legislative vehicle.
Exactly. And so part of our philosophy, I think, too, is that you and I, when we see a problem in terms of the law and public policy, we're like, let's go fix that problem, right? We don't need to create one bill that fixes every problem. Let's create these, in fact, and we choose that.
The narrower, the better.
Exactly, because it's easier to get it over the line.
Implementation,
right?
Not litigation.
And clear and straightforward,
Yep.
right? When you write a bill to solve an existing problem, it's a whole lot easier to get a majority of legislators to sign on to that bill and vote for it than if you write a bill that solves 1,000 different problems in many different ways. You're going to come into a lot more arguments for why that bill shouldn't move forward. And so that's why we run multiple bills every session, right? And so it just makes sense to us to keep non-discrimination policy to those three big buckets: employment, housing, public accommodation. K through 12 schools are not a place of public accommodation, so we don't touch that area. And so, again, not that we won't work on education-focused policy, but this is an education-specific policy.
Right.
So it's kind of a simple overview of how our bill treats K through 12 schools. They're simply not, a place of public accommodation, and we just say that in the bill.
Right.
HB 2625 takes a different approach. It tries to make a big change to one area of education policy, and that's the parental handbook. And so this basically, it puts in a non-discrimination statement into the parental handbook.
How big is this can of worms that it's attempting to open?
We think it's huge.
Right.
Right. We think that one, education policy is very complicated. So you change one tiny piece of, that policy, but then aren't touching all this other policy. Again, the implementation piece is a little unclear, which we think is a problem, right? It opens that door to litigation.
I saw like in the HB 2625, like no discrimination based on age, and I was like, does that mean like a 35-year-old can go to kindergarten?
Yeah, this is a great question because K through 12 schools are segregated by age, right, for learning purposes, and so another can of worms that it opens, right? And so we just see a lot of implementation problems with that piece of this legislation, a lot of lack of clarity, again, opening that door to litigation in specific because Superintendent Horn has made a campaign and career off of being anti-LGBTQ in terms of policy. So
hypothetically, HB 2625 gets over the line, the governor signs it, then the next thing that happens is Superintendent Horn sues.
Right. I would think within seconds of it passing.
Right. And then there's not a severability clause in HB 2625. So what that means is you get this bill signed into law, and then as soon as there's a lawsuit, none of this bill would go into law. Meaning that, it's a for sure bet that there's a lawsuit, number one. Yeah. So it's been over 20 years that some sort of statewide non-discrimination update has been introduced. Right. And because this education piece is in there, there's without a doubt litigation in the education piece. It means none of this ever goes into law, never goes into effect. And again, our responsibility is to get the most protections for LGBTQ plus Arizonans as quickly as we possibly can.
Exactly.
We see with this education piece that this just never takes place.
Right. This, at best is seriously delayed, right?
Right.
Depending on the outcome, but you can't, I don't know if we could depend on the Arizona Supreme Court to come back with a favorable outcome.
It's a center-right Arizona Supreme Court that gave us the brush and nib decision in 2019. So this is an Arizona Supreme Court that has not ruled favorably in favor of LGBTQ inclusive protections in the past. That's their history, right?
Exactly.
You're not employment, housing, and public accommodations don't take place because there's no severability clause. Yep. And then also, can we just talk about the real world harm it does when LGBTQ people, including our most vulnerable members of our community, our kiddos, see their lives and just their very existence constantly litigated, right?
Exactly.
So I just have some real issues with this education piece. Just because while, again, I'm sure the intent is well-meaning, I don't think it's well thought out. And I think that the real harm that it can bring from a mental health standpoint to our LGBTQ plus community, in particular our kiddos, who it's meant to help, I just don't think it's not well thought out.
We agree. Yep. I totally agree. We're on the same page. I think that's...
And here's the thing, too. I know that some people think that Democrats are going to take the majority in the House and the Senate. Again, this education piece says that's not going to matter one iota, because again, you're going to have a lawsuit from Superintendent Horn.
Yep.
You have an Arizona State Supreme Court that has a supermajority that is conservative.
That has sent us back to 1864 recently.
1864.
So yes,
yeah. So I would not want to be in the hands of the court for any of any pieces of these bills, in particular the education piece.
Right. I mean, and again, there's a difference in philosophy here.
Yep.
We don't write and push forward and advocate for policy that is intended to then be interpreted by the courts. Right. We think the proper governmental body for doing this kind of work is a legislature or Congress, right? And so we want to pass statutory law through that legislative mechanism. It's just a different philosophy.
Absolutely.
And so let's get a little deeper on preemption here. We've touched on it a few times, right? Because there's preemption in both laws. The way that we attempt to write preemption into our bill, and the way that we did that is that we anticipate and explicitly preempt laws that would seek to strip protections from LGBTQ
So we've got a
people.
floor in equality and fairness for all Arizonans,
right,
but not a ceiling.
Got it. And so again, the other half of that is we also ensure that greater protections for LGBTQ people can move forward and can stand. So that's a really important difference. We've got that in housing and in employment that we discussed specifically, right? So we've got these preemptive things. We also have it in public accommodations, I believe. Again, this creating a floor, not a ceiling. And so that's very important to us, is once we have those protections, you got to stick by the protections.
Stripped.
Exactly. HB 2625 takes a different approach. They do create that ceiling specifically in employment.
Which literally, again, I want to say, takes existing rights and protections away, not from just LGBTQ plus Arizonans, but for any Arizonan that works for an employer with less than 15 employees in one of the 11 LGBTQ inclusive municipalities.
Exactly.
It's deeply problematic.
Exactly. HB 2625 also doesn't create that floor. And so it doesn't, so it potentially allows negative laws to stay on the books, right? And to impact LGBTQ people's lives potentially. And so we don't want that to happen. We want to create that baseline of fairness, that fair playing field for everybody.
Equality and fairness for all.
Exactly.
Got it.
Exactly. Again, this also opens the door to potential litigation, right? And so again, difference in strategy. We want our bill to go into law the first day that it becomes law and stand. Yeah.
Got it.
We don't want to go through endless legal challenges, right, and court battles that delay the implementation. This is going to
take everyone working together, swimming in the same direction to get this over the line.
It is.
Should this opportunity present itself in 2025?
Absolutely.
We have to compromise. We have to come together.
We do.
And say, this is what we're going to get over the line.
Exactly. And again, this is a non-discrimination bill. So this doesn't solve every problem that faces LGBTQ people, right? It focuses on employment, housing, and public accommodations. It takes those three areas of life and does something that creates greater fairness for LGBTQ people.
Right.
And other people, as we've explained.
Absolutely.
So, on that point, let's talk about religious liberty. So, religious liberty is a first principle, which is a founding principle of our country, right? Along with free speech, freedom of association, all of these things. So, our bill comports with existing law. And whether we like it or not, we've got law in both Arizona and the United States, federal law and state law about religious liberty. And so, our bill does not challenge that. It doesn't say we have a problem with it. In fact, it says, yeah, we believe in religious liberty.
We're working within that. I'd like to say we're not coloring outside of the lines. We're saying here are the boundaries, and we are working within the boundaries to ensure that we have equal protections in employment, housing, and public accommodation.
Exactly.
We're not trying to color outside the lines.
We're not.
Because when you go outside the lines, litigation is the route.
Exactly. And religious liberty, remember, means both the freedom to believe how you want and practice a faith. It also means the freedom to not. And so there's, negative and positive rights, right? And so we have, no matter who you are, you have the right to believe how you believe. And so we want to protect that.
We think that's really important.
That's really important. Yeah. Like, you should not be forced to practice a faith or, belong to an institution that you do not believe in. And so we just think that's a foundational thing that's worth protecting, quite honestly. Our bill, as we've discussed, includes these amazing historic protections that will introduce new protections for religious minorities,
Absolutely.
right? And will really seriously address religious discrimination in all forms in the workplace, which is honestly the number one reason why people are fired in this country, is typically around some sort of faith-based disagreement with a
Well, and I think, again,
workplace.
I think this is about responsibility. I think it's about accountability.
Yep.
As an LGBTQ person, I know what it's like to. We've experienced workplace discrimination
Yes,
in
we
our
have.
family.
Yep.
We know, prior to starting One Community, whenever Sherry or I were talking about coming out in the workplace, they were really difficult decisions, because it was like, will we be able to go without that paycheck if this doesn't go well?
Exactly.
And sometimes it didn't go well, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
the amount of stress that it causes. So, I mean, if you don't have employment, the housing piece is kind of hard, right?
Exactly.
If you can't afford to take care of your family. So everybody should have the right to provide for themselves and their family. Employment non-discrimination is so important, no matter who you are, no matter who you love, no matter how you identify, or no matter what you believe.
Exactly. For everyone.
Yes.
Everyone should be able to go to work. And again, this comes back to that pluralism piece,
Yes.
right? I don't have to practice the same faith as a coworker, right? To be a coworker and to do good work together for the company that we work for. So this also follows best practices established by LGBTQ advocates for decades, right? This is how these laws are written. There are religious exemptions in every single statewide law. And
in all 11 of the municipal ordinances, right?
Exactly.
So this is the norm. Again, we are coloring within the lines.
We are.
Yep.
We're following the established pattern for establishing this kind of protection for LGBTQ people. It's in a way that also preserves religious liberty. And so that's just how these laws are done. We're not trying to change that. We're trying to include Arizona in those 21 states to make it 22. HB 2625, we think does not provide anywhere near sufficient protections for religious minorities, let alone religious liberty. And so, in fact, at the end of HB 2625, the last paragraph essentially is a defunding of any institution that does not abide by, right, this law without any religious exemptions, right, without any consideration for religious institutions, perhaps even because of the way that the definitions work for those associations, like the business women and men's associations, who knows, right? But essentially a removal of public funding from institutions.
So this is an attempt to defund faith-based social services?
That's what we see it as, right? That's what we read it as.
Who's going to provide those services if
I have no idea.
If these faith-based organizations aren't providing them? Like, I know like the Catholic Church is like really big in providing services to like the refugee community.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yes. The LDS community as well, right? The LDS social services. I mean, so many of the social services that, quite frankly, I think most of us in society take for granted as the social safety net, are provided by faith-based institutions, by churches, by actual churches. I have no idea what would replace it, because there is nothing that is to that scale that is not faith-based right now in our current society.
So we would defund the social service
safety net, which would be pretty terrifying, quite frankly, when already, I mean, that socials, those,
they're already stretched,
right? They're already having trouble providing for present day needs, right? To defund them.
Right. And then again, this is litigation.
Yeah, this is massive litigation.
Yeah.
And
from a strategy standpoint, I mean, we should just go to the next slide. Oh, no, we're not there to strategy yet.
Not yet.
Don't forget conversion therapy.
Yes. So our bill includes the codification of Governor Hobbs's executive order that bans conversion therapy for minors. We think this is really important because it is discrimination within a healthcare setting and mental health care setting.
So we don't think we're going to violate the single subject.
Exactly. Because we're saying that if you are practicing conversion therapy, you are discriminating and actually subjecting these kids to harm, right? And so The conversion therapy ban is about minors because minors can't consent, right? Adults, you can do whatever you want as an adult. I may disagree with the decisions you make in many areas of your life, but I don't get to tell you how to live, right?
Right.
So same thing, you don't get to tell me how to live. So we respect that, but for minors, minors cannot consent to this. And so it's a ban on that kind of conversion therapy for minors, because for us, especially for minors, we have seen, as you've mentioned, over the last few years, just the massive negative impact that all of the legislation throughout the country, all of the arguing, right, about LGBT equality and the attacks on LGBTQ equality and our humanity,
kiddos, yeah.
particularly kids, has had such a negative impact on their health. And their mental health. We don't want kids subjected to greater discrimination within a mental health care setting. And so this ban really just says, hey, these protections need to be extended beyond an executive order, because executive orders can change as soon as the next governor gets into
absolutely
office.
And if you don't codify things, again, I mean, you can take a look at Roe, and you can take a look at Arizona Supreme Court 1864 decision.
Exactly. And so we have a conversion therapy ban because it's our belief, and we have this is our legal team's belief, that conversion therapy consists of discrimination within a mental health care setting. And so HB 2625 doesn't address conversion therapy. So ultimately, what we're talking about a lot here is a lot of difference in strategy that ultimately creates different law, right, and different opportunities for implementation. We believe that our bill is written for day one implementation and positively changing the way that LGBTQ Arizonans can live in Arizona on day one.
Implementation versus HB 2625, which, as we've gone through the presentation, we've seen a number of areas where we're really concerned that the path forward is through litigation.
Exactly.
And again, we have a supermajority in the Arizona Supreme Court, and we think that this needs to go the legislative route, right?
Exactly.
And make it to the governor's desk and get signed. And what Equality and Fairness for All Arizonans can do is it can bring real world protections to LGBTQ plus Arizonans in employment, housing, and public accommodations on day one.
Exactly. Which that's our goal, right?
Yep.
It's the most protections, the quickest we can deliver. And this gets it done, where we believe that HB 26 doesn't, right? It opens lawsuits, it opens lots of legal challenges and lots of delays ultimately in those legal protections that include sexual orientation and gender identity.
Yeah, and again, I want people to understand how small this window may be, right?
Yep.
We've been trying in some shape or form, probably for a minimum of 2 decades, to get statewide policy passed. Should this opportunity present itself, and that things have to go the way we think they can go in November, it's imperative that we work together, and that it's our LGBTQ plus community, it's our bipartisan, broad-based business coalition, and our faith-based coalition, everyone swimming in the same direction to get this to Governor Hobbs' desk.
Exactly. That way we can provide for those protections, right? Some other differences in our strategy, right? We don't get rid of single gender spaces. We just make sure they're LGBTQ inclusive. That's a win for everybody, we think, right? We also advance equal protections for everyone in some way. And literally because of the employment number, we're lifting, right? We are creating greater protections for all Arizonans in any protected class, which is amazing. We also have specific protections that advance those protections for people of faith, right, in the workplace, which is wonderful, because that is the number one reason why people are fired in this country, and in the state. And so, the HB 2625, the lack of clear definitions, again, legal challenges day one, right? The K through 12 edition.
Legal challenges
day one.
The preemption employment, legal challenges on day one. I think the housing piece and employment piece, or not housing, but
the public
accommodation piece has some issues.
All of that, legal challenges on day one. Difference in strategy, again, we are trying to codify through, right, the legislative branch. They're trying to move through the courts. Their bill also does not follow the normal model for this legislation, right? Ours does.
Employment,
it adheres to
housing,
that.
public accommodations.
And religious exemptions, right? And so those are part of how these bills are written. And so we think that's important. We want to stay within that established practice.
And listen, we have some experience in this. There are 11 municipal ordinances in the state of Arizona. The first was in Tucson in 1999. One community has played a role. We've been participants in a very broad, in a very integral way, from Phoenix on, right? And so we actually know how this sausage gets made.
We do.
And I think what we're doing is we're really taking over a decade of knowledge and all of the hard work that we've done collaboratively with so many remarkable Arizonans and elected officials, and using that knowledge to hopefully get this to the governor's desk in 2025.
Exactly. And we just think that HB 2625 isn't doing that, right? Like, part of that knowledge is that we live in an intersectional world, right? Where we are not just one thing as human beings. And again, a difference in strategy and philosophy here. We think that 2625 doesn't adequately consider people of non-Western backgrounds and faiths, right? And the LGBTQ community has lots of people of non-Western backgrounds and beliefs, not to mention Arizona, right? And so we believe those people deserve rights too, right? The folks
Equality means equality for all Arizonans.
For all people. So that's what we're working for. We're trying to lift everyone in Arizona, lift our rights, greater protections for all people, creating that level playing field for everyone that includes LGBTQ people and all Arizonans.
Right.
And so
definitely
that's our way forward.
And we've been educating around this bill for a long time, right? So the Equality and Fairness for All Arizonans Act is supported by a number of really thoughtful LGBTQ plus inclusive organizations, not just One Community in Equality Arizona, but 1 in 10, Phoenix Pride, Southwest Center, the Greater Phoenix Equality Chamber, Aunt Rita's Foundation. We also are supported by the business community, right? I love to talk about Local First Arizona, the largest local business coalition in North America. Kimber and her team have so many members that have less than 15 employees. So having Local First Arizona on board and supporting equality and fairness is so important. Arizona Lodging and Tourism Association, the hoteliers, the Tourism Association support us. The Technology Council supports us.
Amazing.
Phoenix Community Alliance, a number of chambers of commerce, the Glendale Chamber, the Peoria Chamber, the East Valley Hispanic Chamber, our friends at the at ACEL, the Asian Corporate Entrepreneur Leaders, the NAACP, the list goes on. Chicanas por la Causa Action Fund. Businesses of all shapes and sizes support equality and fairness for all Arizonans, which is really important, right? Because these employment protections, we really do want to hear about how the business community feels about equality and fairness for all Arizonans. More businesses that are supportive of equality and fairness for all Arizonans, and faith-based organizations, including the Episcopal Diocese of Arizona, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ of Arizona, a number of Jewish-based organizations, our friends at Jewish Community Relations Council. There are more organizations that support as well. We just don't have everyone's logo, but we're working on that. And this is also unique, right? It is. I haven't really seen bills that have been introduced like a year ahead of time, where we're really introducing, because we know that this is about education, this is about bridge building, this is about building a coalition. Now that we've put this presentation together and we've introduced it during Pride Month, our intent for the next 6 months is to educate.
Yes.
We will come to any organization, any group of people that want to hear about equality and fairness for all Arizonans and what's in this bill. Just hit us up. Send us an email or give us a phone call, and we are happy to talk through literally the nuts and bolts of what's in equality and fairness for all Arizonans.
Absolutely. We have gone line by line through our bill with so many people, and we do that because we are really proud of this bill. We worked really hard with our coalition to craft this bill in a way that lives up to these values of pluralism, right? That lives up to the ideas that everyone deserves dignity, safety, respect, privacy, right? Everyone deserves that level playing field that actually makes it possible for all of us to thrive in this state, right?
Absolutely.
And so those are
we're happy to sit
ideas.
down and we want to hear what people think.
We do.
And then obviously this is the kickoff show of Better Together Arizona. We are so excited to first and foremost bring equality and fairness for all Arizonans, this deep dive to every Arizonan that wants to hear more about the bill. But also, this is a kickoff for a podcast that's going to talk about a lot of things.
A whole lot of things.
A whole lot of things,
yes.
Including why it's so important to have an LGBTQ plus inclusive Arizona. But we really want to be bridge builders and talk about the issues that impact everyday Arizonans so that we can truly create a state that celebrates, respects, and protects us all equally.
Exactly. That's what we're here to do. That's our mission.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah. It's so fun to do this with you, buddy.
It's awesome.